Welcome to the Italian Renaissance podcast, where we discuss the culture and art of 15th and 16th century Italy. I'm your host, Lawrence Gianangeli. Andiamo avanti. Renaissance people, welcome back to the Italian Renaissance podcast, where today, in our trajectory towards the high Renaissance in Rome, we have to go a bit backwards in time in order to go forward. Today, we are going to discuss some of the art that manifested in Rome just past the middle of the 1400s. I do recommend that you listen to episode 54 of the podcast titled Rome Reborn, Pope Nicholas V, in order to get the gist around what developments happened leading into this, and there's a bit of overlap as well, since we can truly consider Nicholas V as the first Renaissance Pope, who brought so many innovations and full-scale humanism to Rome in the 1450s. However, we're not talking about popes today, but a cardinal, and his patronage, one of the most influential and important, Cardinal Basilios Bessarion, who commissioned the decoration of his funerary chapel in Rome by a painter of Roman origin, Antoniazzo Romano. Can you believe it? We're actually looking at a Roman artist in Rome, which you wouldn't think would be that unusual. So let us weave together these stories of Cardinal Bessarion and Antoniazzo to try to understand the ebbs and the flows of artistic patronage in this moment of the Roman Renaissance. We do have to do an overview of some very jargon-heavy intellectual history, especially dealing with Bessarion, so bear with me. Bessarion was born in Trebizond, that's on the Black Sea, and maybe around 1403 is the year of his birth, and he received his early education in Byzantium. So he studied Greek, classical philosophy, and he did all of this under the influence of Platon, Georgios Gemistes Platon, who was a radically important Byzantine humanist, and he studied under other Byzantine humanists as well. Bessarion's youth in Constantinople placed him at the heart of Byzantium, Byzantine intellectual culture, and his early career included service within the Byzantine imperial court. And that enhanced his exposure to high-level Greek philosophical texts and networks that would later shape how he is received in the West, namely Italy. When the Church called a Council of Unification in the hopes to repel the swelling power of the Ottoman Empire, Bessarion came to Italy as part of Emperor John VIII's entourage. He entered through Venice. The council was supposed to be held in Ferrara, where they went, and due to plague, it was picked up by Florence. It should be repeated that unification of the Eastern and Western churches failed, and the Ottomans did indeed conquer Constantinople in 1453, which officially ended the Byzantine Empire. We can imagine how impactful this was, and if we remember that it was Cosimo de' Medici himself who hosted the council when it was relocated to Florence, and he was critically involved in the large-scale translation of Greek text and the learning of Greek language in Florence. And now you have the best Greek scholars in the world in your city, among them Bessarion, and this undoubtedly was one of those pivotal moments in Renaissance history. Cosimo and other humanists lamented the fall of Constantinople, sure, but perhaps saw it as an opportunity to transfer the intellectual sphere of influence from Constantinople to Florence, and then ultimately to Rome. After the Ferrara-Florence Council, Bessarion settled in Italy and soon aligned himself with the Roman Church. He never went back, actually. He accepted and promoted heavily the union with the Eastern Church and the Western Church, which earned him a fair amount of criticism back home for staunch supporters of the heretical nature of the Latin Church. His move to Italy was a decisive shift in which he became deeply engaged in the blossoming Western humanism and Greek studies within intellectual circles in Italy. In Italy, Bessarion amassed a vast library of Greek manuscripts and used it as the foundation for humanist scholarship in the Italian Renaissance. His library became emblematic of his mission to preserve and transmit Byzantine knowledge to Western Europe. Doors are opening, ideas are becoming unlocked. It's a notable act was his donation of his entire Greek library to the Republic of Venice, which helped establish Venice as a secondary Byzantine homeland, so to speak, and a center for humanist Greek scholarship in the West, because Venice, as you probably know, is called the door to the east, or the Porta all'Oriente, the door to the Orient, which is a word I don't like to use if I can avoid it. And if that history does interest you, on Bessarion's library, I covered the architecture and the architect of the library, which is known as the Biblioteca Marciana in Venice, the St. Mark's Library, on my treatment of the architect Jacopo Sansovino, a library built and designed to hold the entire collection of Cardinal Bessarion. So you can go listen to that. Bessarion was a prolific writer and a translator who sought to reconcile, this is important, Platonic and Aristotelian thought within a Christian framework. That means pre-Christian pagan philosophy reconciled with Christianity, the essence of the Renaissance itself. He also promoted Greek texts through translations and by supporting Greek and Latin translation projects. His circle included agents who translated and circulated Greek works all throughout Western Europe. So Basilios Bessarion is fundamental in the revival and proliferation of Greek language text and Greek language learning in Western Europe. Bessarion repeatedly engaged in polemics defending Plato. He was mostly a Platonist, and arguing for the compatibility of classical Greek philosophy with Christian theology, which reflects his broader aim of integrating Greek philosophical heritage into Renaissance Christian thought. Bessarion was ultimately raised to the rank of cardinal by Pope Eugene IV. That happened in Florence as part of his promotion of church union and his status as a leading Greek emigre scholar in the Latin West. He held that role of cardinal for more than 3 decades, and he functioned as a senior church diplomat and as a central figure in church politics and diplomacy in Rome. As a cardinal, Bessarion went on diplomatic missions as well on behalf of the papacy to various centers throughout Europe, that be it Venice or Germany or France, even as far as England, coordinating efforts towards crusade planning, right? The crusades were over, but there was always an attempt for a new one, especially against the Ottomans, and his consistent unionist diplomacy, the idea of uniting the Eastern and Western churches, and using his position to mobilize resources for Byzantine relief and, very important, the anti Ottoman efforts. So he was very active on the political spectrum. While based in Rome, and that occurred sometime after 1443, Bessarion organized and supported Greek to Latin translation projects, curated and augmented his Greek manuscript collection, and hosted scholars and translators. He played, this is really important, a pivotal role in expanding Rome's scholarly environment by providing Greek text and by bringing all of these translators on and shaping the intellectual debates, specifically the Plato Aristotle controversy, which we will get to in the School of Athens in a few episodes, and doing this all within the papal milieu and in close collaboration with the humanists who visited or resided in Rome. In all of this, Bessarion has been called the most Latin among the Greeks. Now, of course, Bessarion is not only going to work on expanding the literary and philosophical power of the West, but is also going to commission art in Rome, the most notable being the chapel named after him, the Bessarion Chapel, his own funerary chapel located in the Church of the Holy Apostles in Rome, which he dedicated to St. Michael the Archangel, Saint Eugenia, and Saint John the Baptist, all three of which are revered by both the Eastern and the Western churches. This is going to be the thread throughout this entire conversation, is how Bessarion's patronage and presence is a link and a bridge between the Eastern and the Western churches.
Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Renaissance people, do you want more content and maybe to help support this show? Join me on Patreon for exclusive podcast episodes, or if you want a visual experience, you can enroll in my Udemy course, which teaches the Florentine Renaissance and includes nearly 12 hours of art history lectures. You can also find podcast merch on our Etsy. You'll find links to all of these in the show notes. I want to thank you all sincerely for listening. Now, back to the show. And it was to this church, Santi Apostoli, or the Church of the Holy Apostles, that Bessarion was appointed the titular cardinal. And that is likely not just by chance. This church, in name and possibly in its original form, is indeed in reference to the Church of the Holy Apostles in Constantinople, where Bessarion was trained. Always recurring references to Bessarion and his revered role as a unionist between the Eastern and Western churches. So here you become the cardinal of a titular church that is roughly based on the Church of the Holy Apostles, one of the most important churches of Eastern Christianity. The church also had prominent links to the Basilian monastic communities, which Bessarion was a member of and likely even wore his Basilian habit as a cardinal. The Basilians dress in a black robe. The Basilians were essentially those who followed the rule of Saint Basil, which is an Eastern saint, but they had monasteries in Italy that fell under Western Latin rule and influence. Is all of this beginning to rhyme a little bit? So, Bessarion was a Basilian himself, dressed as a Basilian, and became a cardinal of a church that had links and relations to the Basilian monastic communities in Italy. The artist that Bessarion commissioned to decorate the chapel, that is Antonio di Benedetto Aquilo degli Aquili, or we just call him Antoniazzo Romano. His years are 1430 to 1510. He was an early Renaissance Roman painter, active in the mid 15th century and known for establishing a prominent workshop in Rome and for producing fresco cycles and panel works that helped define Roman taste during the Quattrocento. Bessarion served as a major patron in Rome, commissioning Antoniazzo and integrating Greek emigre patronage into the Roman Renaissance context. That's what this chapel is. This collaboration exemplifies how Bessarion used contemporary Roman artists to project a synthesis of Greek heritage and Latin Roman artistic culture within papal Rome. Is that all complicated? I don't think so. But the Bessarion Antoniazzo Commission is often cited as a key case of patronage that linked Greek scholarly networks with local Roman workshop practice, contributing to Rome's evolving visual culture in the aftermath of the Ferrara-Florence Council, the fall of Constantinople, and within the broader program of cultural renewal associated with Bessarion's diplomatic and ecclesiastical goals. So let's talk about the art now that I've given you this long-winded history of Bessarion. The Bessarion Chapel is cited as one of the largest commissioned chapels in the Quattrocento. It's difficult to get a very good sense of it because it suffered years of damage and flooding. And then in the 1700s, the Odescalchi Chapel was built, contained within the Bessarion Chapel. So they built the chapel on top of it, in front of it. And there's a gap between the back wall of the Odescalchi Chapel and the wall, which has a gap that lets you see Antoniazzo's frescoes. But before that second wall was put up, they were covered in plaster. It wasn't until 1959 that it was discovered, you guys, that the covered fresco wall lay behind the current chapel. If all of that, I hope that all made sense. And what survives of these frescoes were not restored until 1989 and 1990. That is very young in our history of art. So it's a really recent major innovation on how we understand Roman Renaissance. And archival analysis as recent as 2025 by art historian, and I'm really going to mess up this name, Philip Muitians. I think J's in this are pronounced like Y's. Mujitagens. I don't know. I think the Y is better. Muitians. Philip Muitians. If you're listening to this, you can write me how to pronounce your name. This art historian has demonstrated the acute intentions of Bessarion by his new archival study. Bessarion, who ordered the vaulting to be rebuilt in the chapel to help make it bigger, as well as the specific ordering of how and when Mass should be carried out in the chapel, but also that there was a level of exclusiveness to who could enter the chapel, but still, because of its enormous size, it could be seen from outside of the threshold of the chapel itself. The frescoes are divided into 3 registers, which are set into an apse. So an apse is like a semicircular architectural feature in churches in Roman architecture. So the top register is painted into effectively what would be a quarter of a sphere. Okay, and there you see the magnificently colorful rings of angels adoring the Christ in majesty. However, the Christ does not survive. We can only see the bottom hem of his cloak, but it's a standard program. We know that's Christ. From the same archival study I cited above, and I won't try to pronounce it again. We also get clear communication between Bessarion and Antoniazzo with specific instructions on painting the new vaulting, which is summarized as, and I'm going to quote from this study, quote, "The newly built vaults of the chapel were to be covered with azurite and golden stars, with Christ in the middle surrounded by 4 angels and the 4 evangelists, who in turn would each be accompanied by a doctor of the Latin and the Greek churches. These doctors were to be depicted writing in studio, very likely as a reference to Bessarion's own erudition and to his famous library, which he would donate to the Basilica of San Marco in the Republic of Venice in 1468, the year after the completion of his burial chapel." End quote. So what we have here is again the repetition of the specific commission of doctors of the Latin Church and doctors of the Greek Church, where Bessarion is self-fashioning himself and his funerary chapel to specifically demonstrate his role as cardinal at Santi Apostoli was to be a bridge in the union between the Greek and the Latin churches. That is the top register. The middle register, then, is more focused on the legends of Saint Michael and the founding of 2 shrines built upon the sites of where he appeared. In one image, the leftmost image, you see the moment Saint Michael appears in a cave in the form of a bull at the now shrine of Saint Michael on Monte Gargano. In this fresco, archers try to shoot the bull, but the arrows are deflected by divine force. Their anatomies, their bowstringing, the way that this is contrived is indicative of cross-cultural influences of painterly style and the force of anatomy and the force of motion that is being developed in Renaissance art, all happening now in Rome. However, the most important fresco to survive is also a primary St. Michael legend, but ties very much to the social context of Bessarion's Rome. This is the fresco, The Appearance of St. Michael to St. Aubert, 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 I think is how you pronounce that. And this shows the foundation of the most famous shrine to Saint Michael, Mont Saint Michel, in northern France. Saint Aubert is centralized in the fresco, dressed in magnificently rendered gold and lilac, a hand raised in blessing, and his eyes appear as if he is having the holy vision of the saint. Although we know that this fresco is indeed showing the saint consecrating the new shrine devoted to Saint Michael, Mont Saint Michel in France. Standing directly behind the saint are contemporary portraits of two critically important members of the Della Rovere family. Who are they, you might ask? If you've read anything on Renaissance Rome, you've heard of the Della Rovere. In red, we see Cardinal Francesco della Rovere, that is, the future Pope Sixtus IV. Right next to him is Giuliano, which is the future Pope Julius II. So, two superstar popes of the Roman Renaissance, we are truly on the eve of the most substantial power shift in Renaissance Rome with these frescoes. Also important is that this fresco likewise shows the union-based ideas of the patron Bessarion, as we see a group of Franciscan monks in brown and a group of Basilian monks in black. Antoniazzo is able to successfully bring together the desired philosophical, social, and religious program that Bessarion commissioned and desired, and he did this not only as a synthesis of Eastern and Western Christian ideologies, here's the big exclamation point, but also in stylistic synthesis with the painting developments in Florence and in central Italy, many of which he would have been able to see in Rome, such as Fra Angelico's Chapel for Pope Nicholas V, the Nicoline Chapel, which was painted somewhere around 10 to 15 years before the Bessarion Chapel. We have to keep in mind that at this time, all of this structure would have overlooked Bessarion's tomb. He wasn't dead yet. He doesn't die until the 1470s, but that was the program. And now that tomb has been relocated anyway. The final element is the lowest register, the lowest bottom part of the fresco, which was mostly frescoed, but also decorated with a tempera painting on wood panel of an icon of the Virgin and Child. This painting was relocated within the church. So if you go to Sant'Apostoli, you can still see the painting, just not in the Bessarion Chapel, and is known as the Madonna of Cardinal Bessarion, and was also painted by Antoniazzo. I have to say, this is such a magnificent artwork. At first glance, it evokes fully the Eastern traditions of icon painting, looks like an icon painting, and is an obvious allusion to Bessarion and his heritage and impact as a Byzantine emigre scholar and cardinal, but it is simultaneously evidently not a work of Eastern painting at all. Okay, the figures are modeled in light and shade, Renaissance style, although they have a linear quality as well. The Christ child is this perfect blend of child and mature son of God, neither alarming like we see in these old man babies all over Byzantium, nor is he overly cute. And yet, the Madonna looks out at us to remind us of the sacrifice that is both to come and has already occurred, right? Because in our time that we're looking at, this Christ has already been crucified, right? Her hands have this length and grace and delicacy, the kind that we see from artists like Andrea del Verrocchio and Leonardo da Vinci and Botticelli. The background recalls Italo-Byzantine style, that gold background, but it's not just solid gold. Rather, it's a gorgeously rendered brocade, which recalls the textile exchange that occurs between the Eastern and Western Mediterranean. This painting has all of the melancholy and symbolic resonance of an Eastern icon painting with the certain look of Renaissance art being developed in Rome as a synthesis of Italian painting innovations. And it's further Latinized by the Latin inscription on it, which says Concepta absque ulla labe, an expression regarding to the virgin conception of Christ, reinforcing the pure nature of his birth, written right at the bottom of the painting. So to tie this icon back to the main narrative, Antoniazzo connects it to both the history of Rome and the desired effect and presence of St. Michael in the chapel. So we're back to St. Michael, and I'm going to read for you from John Marciari. Here we go again. John Marciari's recent book on Renaissance Rome. This is Art of Renaissance Rome, Artists and Patrons in the Eternal City. And he sums up the St. Michael link a lot better than I could, so I'm going to read for you. And here he says, quote, between the narrative frescoes at the center of the chapel, Antoniazzo worked on a very different manner with his Madonna of Cardinal Basilios, originally set into a niche on the wall but now elsewhere in the church. Here he sought to emulate the style not of avant-garde Florentine painters, but rather of icon painters evoking Bessarion's Eastern heritage, as well as here it goes, guys, this is the important part, Salus Populi Romani icon at Santa Maria Maggiore. This was also associated with Saint Michael, whose miraculous appearance in 590 atop Hadrian's mausoleum occurred when the icon was paraded through the streets. It is for this that the mausoleum was therefore called the Castel Sant'Angelo, the Castle of the Holy Angel. Long revered in Rome, the icon received new attention in the 1460s, and in 1464, a canon at Santa Maria Maggiore dedicated to de Stuteville, which was another cardinal, a long treatise on the work. So this icon heritage related to St. Michael is in 1464 being written about, talked about, repopularized. So the appearance of an icon-like painting in a chapel dedicated to St. Michael, upon which Antoniazzo also copied the Santa Maria Maggiore one, we end up with this huge link between the visual resonance of icon painting and the cult of St. Michael in Rome. I do have to say, I think I slightly disagree with this author's take on this rejection of a Florentine style. I think when you look at the actual figures themselves, it's very clear that Renaissance painting is having its influence on the development of let's call it the Renaissance Byzantine icon, I suppose. In the end, the Bessarion Chapel, in my opinion, is of larger consequence to Roman art than it has had the time and the spotlight to produce. On the eve of the High Renaissance, the idea of a transfer of intellectualism in the West was of critical importance for that to manifest, and Cardinal Bessarion was among the most important hands in that movement of the translatio of intellectual centers from Byzantium to Rome. Bessarion's astuteness shows in his art patronage as well, where Antoniazzo Romano realized his perfect conception and philosophy of synthesis made visual. Renaissance people, we've laid the groundwork for Renaissance Rome now, and in the next episode, we're going to dive into the 1480s, the time of Pope Sixtus IV, and the first phase of the Sistine Chapel. Thank you all for tuning in, and until next time, arrivederci.